Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine in London. Next, he discusses his book on a period of English history he feels is often overlooked. It's titled The Creation of the Modern World, The Untold Story of the British Enlightenment. It's a little over 40 minutes and is this week's feature in our continuing series of books on history.
My name is Tom Padilla, and I'm the events coordinator at Postman Books. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's reading with the distinguished historian, Roy Porter, who is the author of many books, including the recent The Greatest Benefit to Mankind, A Medical History of Humanity, in paperback from Norton, selected as a New York Times Notable Book of 1998. It also won the Los Angeles Times Book Award, which hailed it as a triumph, simultaneously entertaining and instructive, witty and thought-provoking. Earlier this year, Earlier this year, Yale published a book he co-authored titled Gout, the Patrician Malady. The reviewer for the TLS called it a lively and enjoyable reading experience. I read it and loved it, and we thought it was a terrific book, a great cover and a great title. Roy Porter is professor of the social history of medicine at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Science. He is also the editor of the Norton History of Science series. Today he reads from his latest, titled The Creation of the Modern World, from W.W. Norton. Subtitled The Untold Story of the British Enlightenment, it attempts to reclaim the role England and its thinkers and authors played in shaping continental and North American society. Afterwards, there will be a question and answer followed by a signing. Please welcome Roy Porter.
The year 1783 brought to the launching not just of the American Republic, but also, if slightly more modestly, of the Berliner Mittwochgesellschaft, the Berlin Wednesday Talking Society, a debating club typical of those then sprouting in German cities. In a local periodical, one of its members asked the question, "Was ist Aufklärung?" What is enlightenment? And strenuous debate followed. 360 miles to the east of Berlin, in Königsberg, a professor of philosophy offered his contribution. In his answer to the question, what is enlightenment, the great Immanuel Kant defined enlightenment as follows. If it is now asked whether we live at present in an age of enlightenment, the answer is no. But we are living, he said, in an age which is becoming enlightened. Europe, in other words, was in the throes of undergoing the process of enlightenment. This is Kant writing in the 1780s. In order to secure what he called man's release from his self-incurred immaturity, the German professor suggested that people should think for themselves under the watchword sapere aude, dare to know. It was a motto from the Roman poet Horace. The thinker must dare to know, but in his capacity as a bureaucrat, as a civil servant, as a professor, as an employee of the state, he must nevertheless also obey the prince. Kant's denial that his age was enlightened is often endorsed as a kind of truth by historians, yet taken as historical fact, it's utterly misleading. It might apply to his own university city, the modern Kaliningrad, on Russia's Baltic coast to the east of Poland, where Kant had been born in 1724 and where he would die 80 years later. In the entirety of his life, he never poked one of his gouty toes out of East Prussia. Not many Königsbergers, one suspects, had sapere aude engraved over their bedsteads. And Kant's denial that he was living in an enlightened age probably applies to Prussia at large, despite the claims of Frederick II, Frederick the Great, to be an enlightened ruler. A government supported by an army of 180,000 men, tersely commented the English traveller John Moore, may safely disregard the criticisms of a few speculative politicians and the pen of the satirist. Now, a state functionary, a faithful state functionary, Professor Kant's ideal of freedom was as timid as the man himself. Elsewhere in Europe, the question of enlightenment had been raised and many believed had been settled long before Kant's work, indeed long before Kant had even been born. In England, for example, Ambrose Phillips's magazine, The Free Thinker, had adopted Horace's Sapere Aude, Dare to Know, as its masthead as early as 1718, launching an assault on superstition and ignorance. And in a nation in which formal censorship had ceased back in 1695, such an assertion of free thinking raised few eyebrows. By contrast, the Wednesday Debating Society in Berlin positively endorsed the value of state literary censorship. Already by Phillips's time, Englishmen prided themselves upon living in the light. A full 3/4 of a century before Kant, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, had addressed a comrade in the Netherlands in far more spirited terms. There is a mighty light which spreads itself over the world, especially in those two free nations of Holland and England, on whom the affairs of Europe now turn. And if heaven sends us a peace suitable to the great successes we have had, it is impossible but letters and knowledge must advance in greater proportion than ever. I am far from thinking that the cause of theism will lose anything by fair dispute. I can never wish better for it than when I wish the establishment of an entire philosophical liberty. It was clear to Shaftesbury that England at the beginning of the 18th century, along with Holland, was an enlightened state. What I try to do in my book is to ask the question, why is it that historians on the whole don't recognize, acknowledge, and, if they are English historians, celebrate and relish that fact? Why is the English Enlightenment such a black hole in historiography? Well, there are many reasons for that. And one of them, of course, is the innate modesty of the English race. I mean, somehow the idea that we've actually excelled the world in philosophy, metaphysics, rhetoric, intellectuals, etc., seems a vanity that is more suitable to the French or the Germans or or whoever else than us. And of course, there is the other side to that, which is a long and proud tradition amongst the English of being Philistines. The idea that the English are doers rather than thinkers, the idea that it's more fitting for the French to be intellectuals in a kind of Cartesian tradition. And this is one of the reasons why, on the whole, English historians, English men of letters, English thinkers are rather loath to admit that we led the world in philosophy 2 or 3 centuries ago. And of course, not very surprisingly, the French have claimed the paternity of the Enlightenment. It makes perfectly good sense. If you think that the French Revolution had intellectual antecedents, then not very surprisingly, you're going to think that it was the French thinkers of the 18th century, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, the Encyclopédie, Turgot, you name them, etc., who were the only begetters of that great French Revolution. You look to England, there wasn't an English Revolution at the time of the French Revolution. Indeed, England was the great counter-revolutionary country, and therefore, how can there have been an English Enlightenment? Well, I'll solve that paradox later on. Likewise with the Germans. To the extent to which the German nation does produce Immanuel Kant and Fichte and Hegel, etc., then Germany might equally seem to be the main homeland of the Enlightenment. And it's interesting, I think, that so many notable American historians have looked to the French as being the real creators, the crucible, the cradle of enlightenment. And I think it's partly because American academics love to have sabbaticals in Paris. And so it kind of, you know, makes creature comfort sense to look to French scholarship. But it's also because of the very, very complicated Oedipal relationship in the 18th century between Britain and the 13 colonies, the sense that, you know, if America had to rebel against England, then if America is enlightened, if America is the cause of republicanism and religious toleration, etc., then Britain must be cast in the role of villain as a rather unenlightened country. It seems to me, you know, there's an element of truth in that, but in some senses what one can see is America absorbing, the Americans absorbing the importance of liberty and freedom and constitutionality and law and property and religious toleration from the homeland, and then actually putting those principles even more fully into effect than they were being effectuated in England, and more so than on the continent. And what I try and do in my book, and it's a project that has interested me for many, many years, is to recapture that sense that is present in the quotation that I read out from the Earl of Shaftesbury, that sense in late 17th century England, in early 18th century England, and through the 18th century, of England being a nation which in many ways had broken free from the shackles of superstition, ignorance, tyranny, arbitrary government, a police state, censorship, and was actually creating an importantly new world. And I'm obviously not the first person to think that. It was something which so many people in the 18th century already were emphasizing. You only have to read the writings of Voltaire or Diderot, for example, Montesquieu, the great Frenchman who came to England. And what they're saying almost to a man is, this is an extraordinary country. Here is a country which actually has curbed the powers of the king without creating anarchy. Here is a country which doesn't have religious uniformity enforced by bigotry, and yet, equally, hasn't got a religious civil war going on. Here is a country in which there is extreme economic individualism, and yet it is commercially flourishing. Indeed, it's becoming the most potent commercial empire the world has ever seen. So the contemporaries see a kind of paradox in England, that England is an example of everything that autocratic government says we ought to fear, and yet it is a unique and increasing success story. And so there's this great wave of Anglomania and Anglophilia that comes across the continental writers that extends even to admiration for such things as English poetry, Milton, etc., the English novel, largely seen as an English invention, English men of letters, Addison and Steele and Defoe, the Spectator, the Tatler, etc., and maybe above all English science. I mean, that moment where the French finally give up Descartes and admit that Newton is the world's greatest scientist ever. Newton with his symbolic prism and rainbow signifying the triumph of light. You'll remember Alexander Pope's couplet, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Wonderfully blasphemous verses when you think about them hard. And the equation there of England and Newton and light. England becomes the Lucifer, the light bringer of the modern world. So 18th century continentals knew that something was afoot intellectually, culturally, socially in 18th century England. And what I try to trace in my book is precisely what that was. And I think that there were two very important components to that. One component was, if you like, the thought of the age. And it's a thought that is crystallized in many ways in the writings of John Locke at the end of the 17th century, very beginning of the 18th century. Locke is the man who gives the world its first clear-cut liberal contractual theory of government, a theory of government immensely influential later on, not least for the founding fathers of the American Republic. Locke develops a new economic liberalism based upon the sanctity of individual property and therefore curbing the rights and powers of the state to interfere in the activities of the marketplace. Locke, above all, creates a new philosophy of the human mind, seeing the mind as starting off as a blank sheet of paper, open to every educational and environmental experience that is going to come in. Therefore, the human mind, rather than being tainted by original sin, is an infinitely malleable instrument, rather in the way that 20th century behaviorists have thought of it, infinitely improvable. Give a person a good education, give him or her a good environment, and there is no end to the improvability of the individual or to the perfectibility of the species. Locke it is also who creates the educational thought that goes with that philosophy of mind, and Locke it is not least who argues for and provides the blueprint for a philosophy of religious toleration in which all different religious sects can agree to differ, but agree to differ harmoniously rather than with bloodshed, as had been the case in the wars of religion. And what I try to do is to trace in my book the way in which that the settlement that comes about as a result of the succession of William III after the expulsion of James II in 1688, that settlement which brings about constitutional government, the rule of law, the sanctity of property, the sanctity of the person, habeas corpus, the right to happiness, allows in England a further exploration of modernistic ideas, not just in the field of politics, of economics and religion, but, and more interestingly, more daringly, in terms of an understanding of social science along with political science. It's the 18th century that sees in Britain the birth of modern sociology, modern political economy, modern anthropology, an attempt to come to terms with all the diversity and heterogeneity of the races of the globe, and above all, a modern science of psychology, understanding how the mind works, how thought patterns are put together, how the emotions operate, and mind-body relationships there, the ways in which the nerves and the senses are the medium through which thought is actually in operation. And to do that in a manner which is immensely critical of old established truths, traditional notions of the family, hierarchy, authority, patriarchalism, paternalism are increasingly eroded in belles lettres, in popular writings, and not least in the novel itself. And the novel was widely admired on the continent. It's amazing how people like Diderot adulate authors such as Samuel Richardson, Lawrence Sterne, etc., etc. So what you find in the 18th century is a kind of ongoing dynamism of enlightenment within the Enlightenment. What became an established set of Enlightenment values at the beginning of the 18th century increasingly is subject to more and more rigorous criticism as the century goes on in later thinkers such as Bentham, Priestley, and one of my unsung heroes, William Godwin, that strange anarchistic figure who was such a radical individualist. He didn't merely want to get rid of government, he didn't merely want to get rid of marriage, but he wanted to abolish all orchestras, all stage plays, on the grounds that they were tyrannical impositions upon the individual of the thoughts of others. Now that's real radicalism, and it's something rather unique to England. England gives birth to modern anarchism as well. So on the one hand, there's this element of a thought revolution, but thought revolutions wither unless they have fertile soil. And England had that soil for creating an ongoing ferment of thought because it actually had the institutions to carry that out. It had extensive literacy, not universal. It had a revolution in print culture. There was more print coming off the presses than any nation had ever known. The newspaper was new. Periodicals were burgeoning, pamphlets, broadsheets, broadsides. The novel was novel. Belles lettres flourished. There's more and more different stuff to read, much of it, as with Addison and Steele's The Spectator, literally and consistently popularizing for a widespread audience the high-flown philosophy of such people as John Locke. And then you have public institutions for disseminating ideas, for debate, for controversy, for spreading this new secular culture of sociable thought. Above all, the coffee house, very, very popular institution in places like London, but assembly rooms, debating halls, theatres, galleries, museums, taverns, other sorts of meeting places where people can get together and learn the arts of civility and learn the new modern styles of thought and make themselves thoroughly modern people. We are now undergoing an astonishing revolution in our own times. It's the electronic communication revolution. It's the revolution which I sincerely hope doesn't put bookshops like this out of existence, but which is actually creating an additional world, a world of virtual communication out there in space rather than physically in books. Now, the 18th century saw an equivalent revolution, the revolution of printed paper. We don't know at the moment just how far this electronic revolution associated with the web, with its communications, with its whole new styles of mentality, is going to change the way we behave and the way we think. Increasingly, we're recognizing we're in the middle of a gigantic revolution along the lines of Marshall McLuhan's prophetic phrase, the medium is the message. And I think something like that was happening in the 18th century. This great print revolution, putting books, putting ideas, putting fiction into the hands of very large numbers of people was creating wholly new sensibilities. That happened more in England and earlier in England than anywhere else, and in many ways that makes that age the precursor, the cradle, the progenitors of the people we are nowadays. I'd be very glad to invite anybody who wants to comment on what I've just been saying, to ask questions or to refute what I've been saying, to say so, because we are another sociable space, and therefore if you say that what I've been saying is rubbish, then like Voltaire, I will defend your right to say it rather than invite you to a duel or duff you up outside afterwards. Sir? Sorry, I should say that we are being recorded, and so there is a microphone coming around. So if you could wait until the microphone approaches you, that would help.
How much of this growth of the public sphere in England in the 18th century was also the rising of a new class, the middle class?
I think that is true. I suppose I omitted to say that because everybody groans when you talk about the rise of the middle class, because they have been perennially rising through history. I don't think it's so much that there never had been a middle class before and somehow all of a sudden there is a middle class in the 18th century, but I do think that they become newly articulate and newly important, partly because of the renewed importance of the city. It's the urban middle class, it's the importance of city life and city commercial life and the institutions associated with that. For example, clubs, that is new, and London is undoubtedly above all important then. But it's also a way in which this middle class is breaking free from being in the thrall of the clergy, as traditionally it had been in earlier centuries, and is beginning to feel that it can think for itself and express its own opinions independently of clerical tutelage there. So I think that the middle class is not so much new, but it is flexing its muscles and is gathering a confidence in itself, which is new.
Your problem is, why didn't the English get recognition for their role in the Enlightenment? We think of Diderot and Voltaire instead of others. I think it may have something to do with the fact that Hume wrote the Dialogues on Natural Religion and didn't publish them until 50 years later. Now, given the free thought and free speech in England. Why was that? And it seems to me that we would have thought of Hume along with Voltaire if he'd been more published in that period.
Yes, I don't think Hume seriously thought that somebody was going to burn him at the stake if he published his dialogues, but he is himself a notoriously prudent and conservative man who, in a slightly ironical way, uses extremely radical thought to support rather conservative conclusions. I mean, his psychology, which dissolves the self, is one which in the end argues for the continuation of the status quo in politics. So Hume is quite a complicated figure in that respect. I think that one of the reasons why historically and retrospectively the Enlightenment in England hasn't received the historical credit that is due to it is because of the way in which, after the French Revolution, and because of the role of Burke in the French Revolution and Burke's emphasis that abstract ideas and philosophical thought destabilizes, and in the case of France, destroys a regime that was probably worth conserving. Because of that, and because of Romanticism and the Romantic aesthetic and poetic revolt against the sensibilities of the 18th century, the Victorians gave 18th century English culture and thought a very bad press. And to some extent, we've not really freed ourselves from the judgment of the Victorians. And it's quite interesting that the phrase, the Enlightenment, is a coining of the 1860s. And it's used essentially in a negative and pejorative way in order to denounce what is considered to be shallow and glib intellectualizing. So the very concept of an enlightenment in the English language is seen right from the very beginning as a kind of slur and insult.
Thanks. Hi. My question or thought is related to the parallels between, you say, increased or not universal literacy at this time, and how it compares today. How there's, along the lines of there's much more information but a lot less knowledge. So I wonder if you have any, or anyone has any comments or remarks. I'm particularly interested over in England, though, because I think even some people I've met or talked to that are in like lower or lower classes over there still seem much more literate compared to here. But, in comparison with at the time of the Enlightenment, just that fear of today, it being, just information but not really knowledgeable.
Yes, I mean, the plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose phenomenon is very, very common, because those sorts of jeremiads that you hear nowadays, which say, yes, there's more information around, but people don't really understand things, or they don't learn things properly, or they just get a smattering of learning, is something which conservatives and nostalgia mongers in the 18th century were exactly saying. And they were saying, yes, people read the newspapers nowadays, but it's all ephemeral tat, and it's not worth reading. Whereas in the past, people knew the classics, or the Bible, or Pilgrim's Progress, or Milton, or something like that. I don't think that's actually true about the 18th century, because it's fascinating. If you read the autobiographies of working class autodidacts, and of course they are not a representative sample, but it's all we've got. If you read the autobiographies of people like William Cobbett, then what you find is that, as well as being avid for reading newspapers, they are also at the same time eagerly buying up cheap copies of Fox's Book of Martyrs, the Bible, Milton, Pope, Swift, etc. They are buying up second-hand copies. Second-hand bookshops come into being in the 18th century on a big scale. They are buying up serialized books. You could buy books, huge books like Dr. Johnson's Dictionary. You didn't have to fork out 3 guineas to buy the whole lot. You could buy it in parts, 6pence a week, half a letter per week. You could accumulate the Encyclopedia Britannica over the course of a couple of years that way, very cheaply, very simply, very painlessly. There was a real attempt, I think, to get learning through to a widespread audience. And I think the other thing is that what foreigners noticed, I mean, obviously, there was a growing chasm, if you like, between the literate and the illiterate, between those who are really plugged into the smart culture of London and people who are hopelessly rustic. And you find that sort of chasm parodied in a lot of the theatre, etc. At the same time, one of the things that Continentals noticed is the degree to which English society was actually cohesive and inclusive. Continentals who went to an English coffee house said, it's really odd here. You find a few aristocrats here, some clergymen, a surgeon, a physician, etc. But you also find shoeblacks. You also find pastry cooks sitting there, and they're all arguing with each other about the merits of Whig politics or Anglican theology or something like that. Now, it is a world in which once you are literate, then somehow you are admitted into this club and you are part and parcel of the public sphere and the political nation. And that was something that foreigners sometimes admired and sometimes they had great trepidations about, and they thought, you know, God forbid it actually happens back in Königsberg. I don't suspect that Immanuel Kant would have been very pleased to find his shoeblack talking politics. Can you just wait for the microphone?
Sorry. I find your argument to be very interesting, sort of counter to everything I've always believed. But I think that it's not so easy to dispense with the French Revolution. I mean, it's there. I noticed you didn't mention Rousseau. And I think that it's not sort of a historical coincidence that the French Revolution is there. Therefore, all of this attention is given to the French Enlightenment. It seems as if it's a very simple equation. It's the practical result of a society that was at least an aspect of the society that was imbued with Enlightenment thought.
Absolutely, and to some extent I've been playing a kind of conjuring trick, but let me offer the two following thoughts. Firstly, a lot of good historical scholarship over the last 50 years, from Frenchmen such as Daniel Monet to American academics like Robert Danton nowadays, have argued convincingly that the supposed cast iron causal links between the ferment of thought that we call the French Enlightenment, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and the French Enlightenment is in fact a good deal more complicated and obscure than that. And to some extent, those people who were at the center of the French Revolution were those who'd gone beyond Voltaire, who would have regarded Voltaire almost as a kind of embellishment of the Ancien Regime rather than as a genuine revolutionary. So the French situation is a complicated one. And then the other thing I'd want to say is that, if you like, the reason why Britain didn't have a French Revolution at the end of the 18th century was because it didn't need one, because it had already eroded those very excrescences of the Ancien Regime that the French revolutionaries were fighting against, but which had ceased to exist in England in very large measure. Okay, sure, there's still a monarchy, but it is a constitutional monarchy. Still, there's an established church, but there's also religious toleration. Sure, there's an aristocracy, but it is a kind of capitalist aristocracy rather than a feudal aristocracy. So there aren't those glaring targets in England that were so easy for Rousseau or Voltaire or Montesquieu or whoever to pick off. And that's why, I mean, one way of characterizing it is the manner as used by the great New Zealand-born Johns Hopkins historian John Pocock, who wants to say that, yes, there was an Enlightenment in England, but we ought to look at it as a conservative Enlightenment, an equally real Enlightenment, but an Enlightenment that was trying to preserve a relatively free, prosperous and forward-looking state in England from its enemies, who were religious fanatics and bigots of both sides, and from a notion of plebeian ignorance, the vulgar populace, who were trying to drag England back into an old state. What you had in England was a situation in which relative free thinking could be free enough to speculate about mind and soul and body and psyche, and at the same time, genuinely progressive figures could apply scientific knowledge, technological knowledge to manufactures, to industry, to communications, to exploration, to travel, to science, and create that sort of mixture of free market and meritocratic capitalism, which the modern world thrives on and is inherited. You know, it's no accident in that sense that the French Revolution is a French phenomenon and the Industrial Revolution is largely a British phenomenon.
I'm wondering if maybe reasserting the English role in the Enlightenment might be necessary, but sort of then is doing the same thing that ignoring it did, because I'm really interested in how the 18th century could be seen as much more of an international culture. I mean, if you're looking so much at how the Continentals were influenced by the English, then perhaps asserting a specifically English Enlightenment is sort of not productive.
Yes. And I mean, I'm trying to redress a balance, if you like, and I'm very happy if people then say, yes, a lot of the English ideas that people like John Locke were putting forward at the end of the 17th century had Dutch roots. I won't deny that for a second. It does seem to me, however, important that there was a particular conjuncture at almost at the end of the 17th century, which was epochal for Europe. And that was the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, when William III came to the throne, which puts an end to English absolutism and the possibilities of English Roman Catholicism, and creates a kind of new constitutional regime at exactly the same time as Isaac Newton publishes his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in 1687. And that creates this new vision of a stable universe that is the analog, the mirror image of the stable state that eventually the Hanoverians, the Georgians, take over. So there's a kind of version which sees the cosmos, the macrocosm, and the body politic, both working according to fixed and constitutional rules. God becomes a constitutional monarch as much as William III is. And I think that there's a kind of symbolic clarity about that focuses and fixes the minds of Europe in a manner that never quite happens with any event in France or in Germany or in Switzerland or in Italy, etc. There is a kind of way in which it's no accident that when Voltaire gets kicked out of France because he's published libels against the Duke of Rouen, then he comes to England rather than somewhere else, and he writes a book called Lettres Anglaises ou Lettres Philosophiques, the philosophical letters or the English letters. And somehow it fixes in the mind of Europe, bizarrely though it may seem to modern English people, that England was a nation of philosophers.
I think up till now, if anyone has thought of Britain as being having the Enlightenment, it was the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume, Adam Smith, Robert Fulton. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I was waiting for a Glaswegian accent in the audience to come up in that one, or some be-kilted objectioner, and I've not quite got that. But I think that it is in a way anachronistic, though understandable, for us to make distinctions between the English Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, or for that matter, the Welsh or the Irish Enlightenment, because in so many ways, the educated elite in that century saw itself as basically, if you like, English speaking, wherever you had precisely been born. David Hume rather strikingly says the capital of my country is London. And technically speaking, that was true after the Act of Union of 1707, but it's an emotional and it's a cultural allegiance he's thinking of, that he really thinks that somehow the publishing houses of London, the coffee houses of London, the public of London is really his audience and his milieu. And it was the desire of those great 18th century Scottish thinkers, Hume and Smith and Ferguson and Dugald Stewart and so on and so forth, to bring Scotland into the modern world, to assimilate Scotland to the manifest achievements of England, rather than to try to fix a separate path for Scottish development. So, in a sense, what the Scots are trying to do is to modernise themselves ultra-fast in the 18th century, rather than to go in for any kind of Scottish nationalism. And therefore, in some ways, the stress that we've had amongst the historians on the Scottish Enlightenment is a nostalgic call by Scottish nationalist historians to stake out some sort of glorious past for the Scots in an era in which their own politics were crushed. So it's a kind of compensatory mechanism there. It's very noticeable equally that there are so many Irish intellectuals in the 18th century. Burke, an obvious case, Lawrence Sterne amongst the novelists, Sheridan amongst the playwrights, Richard Steele amongst the belletrists, but they're all writing in England. None of them actually stay in Ireland. So the sense of there being a nationalist Celtic Enlightenment is something I don't really see at all. I don't know whether we should bring proceedings to a halt now. Is there one last question? I usually get the feminist question at this, alongside the Scottish question. And I said very little about women in the Enlightenment.
Do say something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I did say was that it was the educationists like Locke who were arguing that because the human mind starts as a blank sheet of paper, then there is no sex in the mind. Women are as rational as men are. And that is a common thread and chorus that runs throughout the Enlightenment, that women have a right and an entitlement to an equal education to men, and they are just as educable, and that properly educated they are just as rational, and that is not just simply good for the woman in question, but is good for the nation, because such women are the educators of youth, they are the mothers, they are the mainstays of the family, and therefore you don't want women to be glamour pussies, you don't want them to be lisping ignoramuses, you want them to be fully rational mothers who are responsible to keep the family together. That, of course, leads to many ironies. Mary Wollstonecraft, arguably the greatest feminist of the 18th century, simultaneously wants women to be independent intellects, and yet also believes that the great vocation of women is to be mothers rather than statesmen or politicians or professionals. And what's interesting is that those are the very debates that have racked feminism at the end of the late 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Once again, the essential modernity of the 18th century debates, I think, comes out loud and clear. Well, thank you all for coming.
Roy Porter is the author of The Creation of the Modern World, The Untold Story of the British Enlightenment. It's published by W.W. Norton. For more information, visit their website at www.norton.com.